Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the next session in the Fragility Forum. This is the session Cultivating What Took Root, looking at Afghanistan. And so we hope that it'll be a particularly optimistic and realistic session. Let me start off by introducing our panelists. Most of them need no introduction. First, we have Nigel Roberts. He's an international fragility and violence expert, and he was the director of the 2011 WDR on conflict, security, and development. Nigel, thanks for joining. Omar Joya, an economist with deep knowledge of the Afghan economy and current executive director of the Biruni Institute, which, as we know, is a leading Afghan public policy think tank. Nahid Sarabi, the former deputy minister of policy in the Afghan Ministry of Finance. She also has deep experience in policy aid and service delivery issues, which will be one of the key topics for today. Rasul Rasuli, one of the world's foremost experts on community development in FCD areas, and previously Director General of the Citizens Charter National Priorities Program. Also another topic that I'm sure people will be very interested in today. And then Dr. Ozola Nima, an Afghan scholar and civil society activist, and the director of the Afghanistan Research and Analysis Unit. My name is Melinda Good. I'm currently the country director for Afghanistan, and I'm sitting with Tobias Huck, known to many of you, our lead economist, and also someone with experience in Afghanistan and love for the country. So we're really glad to have a session on Afghanistan in the Fragility Forum. I think when we started developing this session, we weren't sure what our topics would be or where we would be going. And since then, as I said, the topic of cultivating what took root shows that I think all of us want to learn from what has happened over the last 20 years, learn from the experience of our esteemed panelists, and really think, what does this mean going forward? How can we continue to nurture what took root? Because the international development efforts in Afghanistan over the last 20 years achieved great gains. Development support drove rapid and impressive improvements in human development and economic indicators, and it was because of this development support that more girls went to school, more children survived childhood, and many more Afghans had access to electricity, water, and improved their lives. These were all built on critical institutional foundations. This includes broadly sound economic management, functional central and line ministries, and really effectively outsourced primary health care, and an effective national community development program. After August, I think we all know that these gains are at risk. Development programs were paused following the Taliban takeover. Afghanistan was isolated from the international financial system, and the economy fell into crisis. Economic activity has contracted by up to a third, and firms are reporting laying off more than half of their staff on average. Public services have come under enormous pressure, and 70% of households are reporting that they cannot meet food and non-food basic needs. The international community is moving again in Afghanistan. There's been a huge effort to provide urgently needed humanitarian support. There's a major response underway with up to 24 million Afghans expected to require and hopefully receive humanitarian support. And recently, there's been a very significant move among development partners and everyone involved in Afghanistan, recognizing that the humanitarian response is necessary, but it's not sufficient. As we enter into next winter, we don't want to be in a worse situation than we were in this winter. Now, on the bank side, the World Bank Board on March 1st looked at an expanded approach for Afghanistan. This includes support for basic services using ARTF resources in partnership with the Afghanistan Construction Trust Fund partners. It's also in coordination with work by the Asian Development Bank, UNDP, and ADB, all moving forward to resume support for critical services. So it's absolutely critical to support these basic human needs, but it won't be enough to stabilize the economy or allow for an economic recovery. Without growing the economy and having a sustainable way of providing services and infrastructure, there will not be sufficient economic opportunities for the more than 600,000 Afghans reaching working age each year. So we're facing very serious choices now as an international community. We know that some of the structures that underpin these great gains over the last 20 years have shown incredible resilience. We know that the primary healthcare system is continuing to operate, and community development councils continue to be utilized. They have been working across the whole country. over the last many years, but they are under pressure and they cannot be sustained without further international support. So this session has several important goals. First, I think we'd love to hear from our panelists about identifying the critical structures that supported development gains over the last 20 years. Have we identified the right ones? What other ones would you bring to the fore? And second, can we discuss what are the actions that would be required, both on behalf of the international community and the interim administration, to continue to let these structures take root and underpin a sustainable future for Afghanistan? So as I mentioned, we're joined by a panel with deep experience in the country. Each of them will speak about these topics from important perspectives: the overall state building agenda, the economy, service delivery structures, community development, and civil society, and importantly, public accountability. So it's a big ask. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we do have the experts. And with that, let me turn first to Nigel. Each of our panelists will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to field some questions that come to us through the chat. So Nigel, many thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Melinda, thank you. These are, of course, sad and very difficult times for all of our Afghan panelists and for Afghanistan in general. I just have to say I regret that I have to be speaking to you again for the first time in many months under these circumstances. Nonetheless, there are some very difficult choices that have to be made. And what I will try and do is just say a few words about what we've learned in general about functioning national institutions from the experience of the last 20 or 30 years of working in fragile and conflict-affected countries. So the first thing, the obvious thing, is to say that the research and the practice, so for example, what you find in the World Development Report from 2011 that I wrote, and many subsequent global studies, such as the 2017 WDR and the 2018 Pathways for Peace report, they all highlight how strong and capable national institutions are vital for public welfare. And by national institutions, what these reports and what our practice is talking about above all are government institutions and institutions of central government. In other words, those with national reach. You can, in most cases, identify a core of such institutions as essential to the delivery of basic services. And these will generally consist of ministries of finance and planning, ministries of education and health, community development and or local government, and agriculture. In Afghanistan, as we all know, a corpus of these institutions was built up over a 20-year period. And our experience shows us that a generation is essentially what it takes to build capable national institutions, and that there are few, if any, shortcuts or workarounds. Today's reality is a sanctions regime that inevitably compromises efforts to sustain these institutions and impacts on public welfare in Afghanistan. International experience tells us that attempts to bypass central government and to substitute for it with combinations of UN humanitarian efforts and NGOs is most unlikely to sustain public welfare. And I would put it to you that that is likely to be the case in Afghanistan as well. I indeed know of no case where services were successfully delivered over time and at scale without substantial involvement by the government. NGOs are vital. In Afghanistan, they always have been. But unless they're working in some kind of harmony with the government, you are likely to see an exacerbation of tendencies that we know all too well, such as fragmentation, competition, inefficiencies, duplication, and a lack of scale and coverage. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that working with the Taliban is an easy proposition or particularly palatable to many of those who've been associated with Afghanistan's development over the last 2 decades. But from an international perspective, I'm afraid to say that the Taliban would not be the first distasteful regime that donors have elected to work with. Indeed, a significant number of the regimes that the international community works with across the world are in various ways fairly obnoxious. And that is part of the art of development, of actually working with second and third best solutions and always with the risk of contamination. That's the business we're in, not only in Afghanistan, but everywhere else. And I also think it's important to be clear about one's objectives. If one continues to pursue a policy of shunning cooperation with the Taliban government, is the purpose of this to promote the deliberate destruction of institutions that have taken a generation to build? Presumably not. But if so, what is the purpose of this? Is some other more beneficial national governance alternative in sight? Is that the objective? And what are the reputational consequences to the international community of failing and being seen to fail to alleviate the suffering and the basic needs of the vast majority of Afghans who have had no choice but to stay in their country and try to carry on with their lives? Let me stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel. This was a great start in putting forward some very challenging questions. So let's continue hearing from our experts. Next up, Omar, let's turn to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be speaking at this very important panel because I think it coincides with a critical time for Afghanistan. The Taliban just had their 6 months in ruling with their de facto government in Kabul. At the same time, given the growing humanitarian pressures, the international community is now deliberating on how to go beyond the emergency operations towards re-engagement in development programs that are critical for the people. But without necessarily providing legitimization to the de facto regime or making compromises, such as abolishing the sanctions, I strongly believe that national foreign assets, which belong to the people of Afghanistan and to the future generations of the country, must be protected from any type of misuse and must not be released as long as an inclusive political system is not in place. On institutions in economic management in the past 2 decades that I'm supposed to talk about, I'd like to highlight 3 achievements and 3 failures from the past 20 decades. Although there are certainly many more achievements and failures, but I think these are the most important ones to keep in mind. On achievements, let me first mention institutionalization of market economy principles that helped ensure trade openness, private sector development in the country. The reason that I mention this as an achievement is because the previous 4 decades leading to 2001, the country consistently had a regulated, centrally planned, and state-run economy. And despite some grievances that emerged due to excessive deregulation and due to privatization processes that took place in the early 2000s, there was never any widespread public resentment against the market-based system. So I do see that as an important institutional achievement in economic management area. Second is the development of institutions in fiscal management and monetary policy, including the knowledge cultivation of modern economic management practices in the Afghan government agencies such as the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank. I'm not going to speak more about that because I think Ms. Naid Sarabi in the panel will be talking more about that. And third, I think the impressive economic performance prior to the security transition that Afghanistan had is also worth mentioning. Over the course of 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, the growth rate was about 9.5%. Per capita income increased threefold. So this rise in the average per capita income enabled private entrepreneurship, emergence of technology-based service sectors, and access to knowledge. Without these, strong economic performance, I don't think any of these would have been possible to achieve. Now, on the failures in economic management institutions, first, I believe that we failed to develop pro-core institutions that would have made the economic growth process more inclusive and that would have led to increasing economic resilience in the country. After 2 decades of investing about $160 billion in foreign aid, poverty still stood at about 50%, even prior to the COVID pandemic and last year's political collapse. I think there was an emphasis on growth maximization instead of an inclusive growth. We prioritized the level of growth rather than the quality of growth. But although the World Bank, the government, and all other actors agreed that, for instance, an agriculture-led growth was the most effective strategy for poverty alleviation and ensuring growth sustainability over the long run, such a strategy, an agriculture-led growth strategy, was never adopted as a national policy or as a national strategy. Third, I believe, the second failure, I believe, is that despite a dozen of strategy papers that were produced, starting with the Afghanistan Compact in 2006 and including the Afghanistan National Development Strategy and ending with the ANPDF document of President Ghani's administration, I think we lacked a coordinated and concerted approach to poverty reduction. Poverty reduction agenda was never treated as a national priority. Coordination between the state, the donors, as well as among the donors themselves was poor, which resulted in huge inefficiencies in the use of aid money. Finally, the third one, although it's not a failure per se, and it's a consequence of the political shock, but I think it's important to raise this here because it makes the re-engagement of the international community in development areas in Afghanistan once again challenging. And it's the brain drain and immigration of a large pool of professional and qualified talents out of the country that is taking place since August last year. In institutions, it's not just about a set of rules and regulations or processes or a set of management and technological systems that are put in place. It's also about the human dimension, the human capabilities to functionalize these processes, regulations, and systems, and the regulatory and technical know-how in running the institutions. But now, with the mass departure of the pool of talents from the country, I think the donor agencies and international institutions will find it difficult to integrate and involve local talents with knowledge of the local context into the early stages of development project design and implementation. And let me finish my talk with just a small note that re-engagement in development areas in Afghanistan, it means working for the poor. We work for and with the people. And it does not mean that we work with or for the Taliban. And I think we have to distinguish that. It's very misleading to actually mix the two visions that we have and then use any of these the need for re-engagement as an argument that, well, we can just live with the Taliban. No, we cannot live with the Taliban. The system has to change. We know for evidence, data shows that if you look even throughout a generation, a 30 years time lapse, a non-democratic, non-inclusive political system will not succeed. So even if you invest $160 billion in foreign aid, once again, repeating the same mistake, and it will be just be repeating the same mistake. So I think we have to not lose the focus and emphasis on asking for democratic economic institutions that should be placed, because that will increase the effectiveness of your development engagement in the country. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. More excellent points, and again, challenges to think about why and how we're engaging. Really well, building on what Nigel said. So let's continue the discussion and go next to Nahid Sarabi. Nahid, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melinda. A very good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm really honored to be part of this forum. This is a very opportune moment, as Dr. Joya and other participants noted. It is also an opportune moment to not only discuss engagement in fragility context, but also how not to cause fragility would be another discussion, I think, topic. Today, I'm going to talk about the role of national priority programs in the context of service delivery. And I want to start with a little of background that what are these national priority programs and how they have been important. Afghanistan's economic development was guided by 3 episodes of development strategies since 2002 that were implemented through a set of national priority programs. These programs were based on fiscal scenarios, and as Mr. Joya alluded to, Afghanistan has built an infrastructure and capacity of fiscal and economic analysis that then based these national priority programs on. They provided a structure for implementation of government priorities that included revenue generation, service delivery, and also reform building. But what were the other unique selling points of these national priority programs, as we called NPPs? They emphasized first on national coverage, on institution building, on human capital building, and also detailed out implementation, architecture, and monitoring. Above all, these national priority programs and development strategies as a whole provided guidance for development actors, especially donors, to coordinate and align their aid to these national programs. But what are some lessons learned that can be relevant to today's engagement? And I want to emphasize engagement for people-centered approaches. As they were called national priority programs, some of these programs expanded beyond their realistic goals. Sequencing and prioritization became a challenge in implementation. There wasn't enough balance between resources required and resources available and required investment. The implementation also suffered from consistency in some of sectorial regulations and policies, especially in the context of security and political uncertainty. There was a variation of political will for robust implementation across different sectors. What can be the guiding principles going forward? Can we really use national priority program approaches going forward? And I want to again emphasize that although there are trade-offs between how to engage in this politically sensitive environment in Afghanistan, there are methods that we can be focusing on the needs of the people rather than engaging with the administration or regime. International community has invested on some impactful flagship programs, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Melinda, that they have achieved some notable results. It is important for all stakeholders to preserve the results of those investments. It's a challenging period for Afghanistan, but we also have some lessons learned from the engagement of development actors during the 90s. But although that is important, let's bear in mind that the demands are different today. There is a base of professionals that is still present in Afghanistan, and the systems are much more complex than it was in the 90s. So it requires a different approach. It requires further elaboration and deliberation. It is important for all actors to move beyond maintaining a light footprint in Afghanistan. Humanitarian is necessary, and it was well taught 6 months ago during the very difficult periods, but it is not enough and sustainable. It is important that more and more people are not pushed to poverty, and that it's important that people are pulled out of the humanitarian dependency, and this circle shouldn't continue. Humanitarian with an extension to basic needs and services is direly needed. I want to name some of them that were also some of the very good national programs that were implemented together by the previous governments and donors, that is health, education, and rural infrastructure, all of them with focus on women. Let's not forget that. At the moment, there's a strategic and development programmatic gap. Earlier, as I mentioned, there were development programs and strategies that guided the coordination and development efforts. I think with government not being engaged, there is that programmatic gap that could be felt by donors and development actors. It is time that everybody takes a programmatic angle and approach to development and operate under a humanitarian plus programmatic framework. One of them is a model could be continuing with the previous national priority programs or programs, and we shouldn't restart or reinvent the wheel, but focus on ways as how to implement it in a different environment. One of the things I want to focus here is division of labor among UN agencies and other development platform. It is important that there is a coordination platform for everyone to pick a sector and implement, and not that everybody implements a bit in piece and few division of labor principles are not taken into consideration. I also wanted to maybe highlight a few other issues that could be important in delivering services and basic needs under the umbrella of kind of a national program. National programs have built, and I think Dr. Omar mentioned about the brain drain, but I'll also emphasize that there is a large network of professionals, especially in the communities in rural areas of Afghanistan. These network of professionals need to be protected, maintained, and the service delivery should be delivered through them. It is important for service delivery and also for protection of the human capital, institution, and network of the country. It is important that systems and architecture through which the services were delivered are revived and used and maintained. When I say architecture, I again do not insist delivering through the government, but development actors could be agile in funding and implementing these systems and environment of the government systems that could be easily transferred to the government when political situation is suitable. Some of these systems could be databases, could be softwares, could be monitoring systems and architectures that were developed through these national programs, and they should be maintained as capital and investment of the past years. Development actors have invested on a network of essential infrastructure, especially in rural areas on health, education, health facilities, school buildings. It is crucial that these infrastructures are maintained, taken care of, and that they shouldn't depreciate. Last but not the least, I want to emphasize on the role of private sector. They have played an important role in the past few years, and their role and support to private sector should not be ignored. But I also at the end emphasize that service delivery should be driven by principles of national coverage, non-discrimination, and inclusiveness. I end my notes here, and if there are any questions, we'll be happy to get back. Thank you.
Mahid, thank you so much, and really getting into some of the nitty-gritty of what were the programs and challenging us to think going forward. I just want to remind our participants that you can submit questions in the chat function. I see that there are some coming in because there will be an opportunity to direct questions to our panelists at the end. Let's continue now with Rasul Rasuli. Over to you for the next set of comments.
Thank you, Melinda, for having me, and great pleasure being here. So I go a little bit to the background of community development in Afghanistan. So historically, Afghan communities participated in community development through collective actions, being hashar or other sorts of collective action, mainly involving activities of such as canal cleaning, quarries cleaning, cleaning of access roads, building access roads and pathways, responding to the emergency situations during natural disasters, helping the poor during harvest season through collection of osher and other initiatives at the community level. And it was only early 1960s to 2002 where NGOs and UN organizations, UN agencies involved in a more structured ways to engage with the community members and help them with the implementation of projects in different sectors of health, education, nutrition, relief, and natural resources management, and started building community forums. And then between the years 2003 and 2016, the National Solidarity Program came and laid the foundation for a more structured community development platforms through establishment of more than 35,000 elected non-governmental community institutions at the local levels who served over 25 million rural populations during these years and through implementation of over 88,000 small-scale community infrastructure projects, including provision of water sanitation projects, access roads to markets, irrigation canals, health facilities, school buildings, and livelihood projects. Through implementation of these projects, the CDCs, the Community Development Councils, created over 75 million labor days also, which was a huge contribution to maintaining the jobs markets and avoiding population movements and all that. And between 2017 and 2021, the National Citizens Charter Priority Program built up on the experiences of the National Solidarity Program and expanded its rollout to 1/3 of the country, again with different approaches, slightly different approaches and more inclusive ways of social mobilization and inclusivity, expanded on into the major urban areas, including 4 cities, through around 13,000 community development councils serving around 14 million populations. And by August 15, the community contribution that came from the at least 10% contribution of the communities and labor or kind or even cash reached to over $204 million, which was a huge contribution in the aid delivery as a whole as well. During 2020 and 2021, when the country was hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and the government and also aid architecture resources were stretched, the CDCs also played a vital role in distribution of COVID-19 relief packages to over 10 million rural and urban populations. Other achievements of CDCs in the past 5 years included their outreach, obviously, across the country, including rural and urban areas, 300 and over 361 districts across all 34 provinces and major cities. Another big achievement was inclusion and participation of women. Over 150,000 community members participated and had the membership, elected membership into these inclusive bodies, being the CDCs. The CDCs were able to create over 11,500 community food banks, which helped tens of thousands of poor and vulnerable populations during difficult times of lean season for multiple months. And that was with a very minimal operations cost and mostly supported by the community contributions themselves. CDCs also offered an entry point for supporting the women, and there are independent reports, including the ARTF third-party monitoring report, indicating that in over 85% of CDCs, women participated in development planning. Also, a report from CARE International 2020 indicates that CDC and separate CDC women committees, which were the subcommittees of the CDCs, are viewed as the most effective spaces for women participation. The same report from CARE International indicated that community women turn to CDC women and CDC subcommittees of women and see them as an area where they can influence public decisions. Also, another report from CIGAR 2021 indicates that CDCs enhance the effectiveness of development projects to better address the concerns and priorities of women in rural communities. So this is quite relevant in the current context where limitations around women participation is challenging. It also is challenging through the CDCs in a number of places, but still anecdotal reports as well as two recent surveys, very rapid surveys by the World Bank indicates that women are still members of the CDCs and aid reaches women through the CDCs where CDCs are involved in aid distribution. Again, while variation across the country is around CDCs, but CDCs have proven to have enough resilience to cope with different challenges and changing operating environments, including the current situation and again, reports and indications from the last two rapid surveys by the World Bank indicate that 85% of CDCs and 88% of the provinces and districts are still involved through the NGOs and UN agencies in aid distribution, which is significant and needs to be acknowledged. There are challenges in a number of provinces. 4 provinces were reported as challenging in areas around women participation and decision-making and identification of target beneficiaries. But in other 30 provinces out of 34, CDCs have been involved in aid distribution. the new political environment and the expectations from the current de facto officials initially were a little bit skeptical of not a little bit, strongly skeptical of the CDC's role, but eventually over the passage of some time and over the past few 5-6 months, where CDCs have been involved in aid architecture at the community level and prove their capacity and ability in more accountable and transparent ways, that has started to change the mentalities around the political cloud as well. And it looks like there are more acceptance in the current environment towards CDCs being functional and operate. With that said, the CDCs are still there, but need a lot of support to be protected from political influences, as well as strengthen their negotiations power to negotiate for their roles and independence, and also have the space for civic, the civic space for more participation and benefiting the more vulnerable populations at the community level. So capitalizing and protecting this huge social capital, and I looked at some numbers also by the end of NSP, not to speak of the Citizens Charter achievements. There were over 350,000 elected CDC members who were part of the aid architecture and are still there out ready to contribute. I'll stop there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So thank you for taking us to the community level where there was so much change and can continue to be. So let's go to our last panelist who will talk to us about civil society and public accountability. Dr. Abdullah, over to you.
Great pleasure and honor to return to the Fragility Forum. I was involved in the program last year, and it's with sad realities on the ground and how things have developed. At least I think it's important to have such timely conversations and discussions. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here and share some of our thoughts and reflections. The triple factors that are also basically the theme of this forum, COVID, climate change, and conflict, are in the last, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, have directly affected Afghan population, particularly the poor, whether urban or rural poor, in a record level. Over the last year, our research and studies highlighted how the core socioeconomic impact of these three drivers of poverty and vulnerability basically affected communities across the country. We had record level of violence up until August last year. We had a massive drought, and we had the COVID waves coming in and going out. So what happened since August last year in Afghanistan in terms of, probably we will not have the opportunity here to discuss about the political changes, but more from a development point of view, there has been a sudden and complete collapse of with two key dimensions from a development perspective. An immediate closure of all major development and infrastructure programs and projects, such as the ones that respected panelists were talking about. Most of the national priority programs were closed. Most of the massive Citizens Charter program and many other programs have been collapsed. And then the second dimension was the collapse of the banking system that did not only affect those relying on development aid and assistance, but also every single household who were depending on a civil servant salaries, small and medium enterprises, even simple trading services and small businesses. Everyone was affected by the banking crisis. So just to give a picture to the audience here, what happened in Afghanistan and following the earlier conversations we witness a situation of first creating a massively development-dependent or aid-dependent country, and then switching everything off right after 15th of August. The aid and assistance over the majority of the people in Afghanistan have been switched off. Few made it out for their own safety and protection, and majority of the working class or the technical or the bureaucrats, everyone is in the country, as Mr. Rabi said, and it needs to be built upon. So the larger picture for the people of Afghanistan in the post-August 2021 context is filled with a strong call for humanitarian assistance from the UN and international agencies, everyone alarming about the severe level of poverty, starvation, and massive migration due to these mentioned reasons. And also for the fear of, people fearing the prosecutions by the ruling regime. So the donors are responding to these humanitarian appeals in the way of basically asking for specific humanitarian assistance, focusing mostly on providing food items and trying to prevent starvation that the people are facing. But it also raises a number of questions about the level of accountability of this new enlarged humanitarian structures, and in particular, the level to which the civil society organizations and institutions are involved or could be potentially involved in this process. And most importantly, another very important factor is whether humanitarian aid and assistance, as other panelists also mentioned this, is a response to the current crisis that Afghanistan is facing. So we may not have a very detailed time to go into the full explanation of all this, but I will make an attempt to briefly first introduce a little bit the Afghan civil society. So what civil society really means in the Afghan context. Civil society organizations or individuals active on this role are a progressive part of a society that aims to bridge between people, the state, and the market. Historically, in Afghanistan in the 19th century, religious scholars were part of the civil society and a very vibrant and active part of the civil society by calling for reforms of the system. In the contemporary context, during the first 2 decades of the Afghan wars, I'm talking mostly 79 onwards, first 2 decades, NGOs or non-governmental organizations funded mostly by the Western allies have been basically filling not only a role of a civil society, but also in part role of the state's role on service delivery. But in the post-2001 context, with the large presence of the international community in Afghanistan, the Afghan civil society evolved as an amalgamated form of traditional and modern civil society that is basically playing an important role, not only in the development of the country, but also in the progress and basically building a human capacity in many, many sectors. So in the post-2001 context, Afghan civil society operated in a much more open environment. Its members fulfilled the roles with more recognition from the state institutions and also from the public, as we saw. They have worked in promoting civic education, advocating for legal reforms, different policy advocacy issues, and so forth. The most significant roles that we would see in the civil society sector are the role that media played in Afghanistan and also women-headed organizations. Community development councils, as mentioned in detail by Mr. Rasooli, different community-based organizations, women local councils, religious organizations, academic institutions, and so forth, are representing a diverse nature of Afghan civil society. With the changes since last August, there is a grave concern about the future of civil society organizations and activists within the country. But I believe that as an organic and dynamic part of the society, these organizations or individuals will continue to evolve and find their place to play in the society, the role that they can play. What we already see and is evident over the past 7 months is people's active mobilization at the community level, demanding for more schools and clinics and hospitals, asking or taking part in massive campaigns for girls' education. Girls' education, by the way, is basically restricted now up to primary level only across the country, with the exception of few provinces. And also different other parts. We also see that women are taking streets asking for basic rights such as food, jobs, freedom. Non-kar azadi is the slogan of these women coming to the streets. So the continuation of these activities in themselves is a clear indication that the Afghan civil society is active despite the challenges, and they deserve an attention, not only by acknowledging that they exist and they continue to work, but also to involve them in the process of Afghanistan's development and Afghanistan's need assessment, as we say. So I know time is limited, so I'll just briefly draw on some recommendations, and building upon the conversations from other colleagues, I would like to sort of emphasize on the importance of learning lessons from the past. Afghanistan, to the whole world, to the discussions like international forums like this one, we have the capacity of not only being the recipient, but also being practitioners of the development aid and assistance in conflict and in a fragility context for over decades. So don't see us now as refugees across the world or as people helpless just in the need of humanitarian aid, but bring us involved in these conversations in order to help the international community, in order to learn lessons from the past. International donor and aid agencies also need to realize or acknowledge a broader understanding of civil society in the local context, and then look for strategies to engage them. Finally, to further pause, I would like to emphasize on the downwards accountability when we talk about the humanitarian assistance and aids. And we see a lot of accountability discussions more in the format of reporting to donors, but we really need to be accountable to those who are receiving this assistance. And there is already a growing concern about the questions of transparency and accountability to the communities who are supposedly the recipient of the humanitarian aid. And finally, a very important message that I would like to use this platform to communicate to all the respected partners of Afghanistan is that humanitarian assistance, like my colleague panelist, Mr. Rabi, also mentioned, was definitely a priority and a need 6 months ago when the country was in that switch-off situation that we explained. But it may not be on this estate forever. We need to find creative ways and strategies to go beyond humanitarian assistance and look into development aids in assistance in ways that are more sustainable, in ways that are helping the entrepreneurial nature of Afghan society further to progress, rather than keep feeding them until the next day that we don't know how long that could continue. Thank you very much. I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Argala. So basically you put the question to us, the challenge, which Nigel started with as well, which is sort of how do we all work together to move toward a sustainable and less dependent structure? So Tobias and I have been going through the questions that have been coming in on the chat. Several came in that were around civil society and capacity building, which I think that Omar, Rasul, and then Argala, you answered as the conversation continued. We have a very short time left. So if you'll forgive me, let me ask one of the questions and go to Nahid and then Nigel. In a way, this is a wrap-up question, and it goes back to this challenge that Argala ended with, which is, if we take as a given, Nigel, what you told us at the beginning, which is really there's been no case where it has worked to effectively deliver at scale without engaging with national actors. But Nahid and Nigel, you both touched on it. So how would you see that transition? What would a strong framework look like? What do we need to do in the next month as we head into this humanitarian pledging conference and then the World Bank spring meetings in order to start to make that a reality, to think now about a transition that may come later? Tough question, but let me go to Nahid and then Nigel on that. And we have maybe 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes each.
That is a very tough question. And sometimes the lines can be easily blurred as who you support. And with this support, are you strengthening a regime that is not legitimate? But my very quick comment on that is, again, I alluded to it, a platform between current active donors, including UN agencies. And once again, World Bank and IMF's engagement is very crucial at this point in Afghanistan. Engagement, again, I refer to engagement in terms of economic monitoring, economic analysis, not engagement with the regime, is to provide a platform and design a common program that could be delivered and that can include these essential services going forward. And what I want to, there have been different propositions on how to do this in terms of practically to transfer, for example, money and cash to Afghanistan. And we could take some of those options and act quickly. I think there could be a pilot program or project that could be tested on the ground and see how it can deliver services quickly to people, and start on building on some of the lessons and systems that existed during the implementation of these national programs, and transfer it to a system outside the government that could easily be transferred back when the situation is suitable. I hope I tried to answer it in a quick way, but hope it conveys the message.
No, thank you. And that puts the challenge to us. So Nigel, the same thing. Also, please challenge all of us. What should we do in the coming months on moving towards this transition? Over to you.
Melinda, thank you. Well, I think a lot depends on what you mean by a transition. And to me, it's not so much a transition from humanitarian to development assistance as it is a transition towards working with the government. Let me just repeat, you really cannot operate national basic services without the significant involvement of the central government. And that's not just in Afghanistan, that's in any country that we have experience of. And so in a sense, the choice here that faces the international community is, will they do whatever they can to sustain the welfare and livelihoods of the population and accept some kind of compromise that involves working with a government that they find deeply distasteful? Or will they prioritize its continued isolation and the degrading of that government without what appears to me to be any clear objective in sight? And that means, of course, accepting a decline in public welfare. I don't think we should delude ourselves that we can have it both ways.
Thanks, Nigel. I think this is exactly the challenge we all face. Anyone working on or for Afghanistan in the coming months. I think we will take that forward. And maybe I see we have less than a minute left. I know that the next session will start. Maybe this was a very rich discussion. There were a lot of questions that came up, which we'll take note of and think of another forum in which to talk about those. But I think really you've laid out the challenge for everyone in our thinking. And perhaps just to conclude, going back to one of Omar's comments, which is perhaps a way for all of us to think about the challenge that Nahid and Nigel ended with, is to remember that we are working with and for the people of Afghanistan, the people we've all worked with, whether we're Afghans or those of us who love the country, and that remains the case. So thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. I know we wish we could have had a longer time, but it was very important that we bring together this group of people who have done so much and built so many of the institutions that took root over the last 20 years and have this as part of the Fragility Forum and challenge ourselves going forward. So really, thank you very much for joining us. And I think that the session will soon switch over to the next session and hope to continue this in another forum. Thank you very much.